Continuing, in regards to our renaming of the three forces and their possible correlationship to the three time frames. And we were sort of right at, for instance, the second one of that we'd renamed the what do you want? And then we were taking a little bit further and saying what if, what do you want? What if we treated it as if? Or if we treat it as being equal in a certain kind of non-literal way to a time frame, in this case the present. So what if there was some sort of unmeasurable correlation, connection between this kind of second force that we were, for our own nefarious pleasures, calling what do you want? What if it in some way was connected to the present? And we were also noting that how disinclined the ordinary intellect seems to be to deal with the present, assuming that there is such a creature and assuming that man would even recognize it. But we had noted that more or less the ordinary mind is not constructed, is not made to deal with the immediate, with the present. Still assuming, since ordinary people say they are, but assuming there is such an actual creature. And we were about left at the place of pointing out that if it were possible from some ordinary, semi-ordinary, reasonable view of trying to perceive, much less trying to describe some possible purpose for man, over and above the food chain, over and above the primary level that he would be serving as much purposes, in most cases at least as much as your North American brown bear, and such as that, but in this way that man likes to think of as being unique to him, what we've been calling the secondary world, that if it were possible to in some way try to perceive, try to describe what might be a purpose, over and beyond the old, ordinary, religious, which is about the best one that people have ever come up, the most widely accepted, we should say, that the gods, through whatever religion, whatever part of the world, that the gods in some way have put man here to do their bidding, to do battle for them against the forces of evil, to repay a debt, as an experiment. I'm not going to say it's a bad joke. No, I'm not going to get involved with it. But if it were possible, in some way beyond all of that, we'll assume that none of that, that all of you have been through enough of that, that you find it to be oatmeal with even the blandness extracted. So I assume that that is not the area in which you like to stand around and spit and sing doo-wop songs and harmonize with your fellow thoughts. So we'll assume that you would be left, we will hope, at almost over at some corner that's almost blank. Like if there is some purpose, I'm not, the other stories, I'm no longer wrestling with them, and you don't have any particular polarized attitude other than the fact that they just don't work. All right, so if there were a little bit beyond that, just to get us going again, we're going to get up to speed here in a second. That if it were possible in some way to try and perceive / describe a purpose for man's secondary, his intellectual existence here, then I was proposing that it would have to be within the context of some extraordinary view. That is simply, not through any fault of the institution such as religion or psychology or sociology or anything, but that at all ordinary views you must be able to simply see it for yourself, to feel it, that all the ordinary views inside of a box, the box may, or according to Kyroots, all boxes have a purpose. But inside the box, the purpose is not all that easily determined. Of course, he put it a little stronger, being that devil-may-care verbal devil that he is. He just said that it cannot be. I could put it to you another way, if you're in a closet, if you're born in a closet, and maybe a fine closet or otherwise, and closets obviously have some purpose, but if you stay in the closet, may I say that your actual understanding of the purpose of a closet is somewhat limited. You may come up with fine stories, you may become your own fabulist, and you may not even soil your own mind with some of the condiments available on the battlefield. But still, there's a certain limitation that someone outside the closet would have a different view. So I'm suggesting that if there is a purpose, it would have to be seen from some other context, and not meant, as you know, in any sort of spiritual or metaphysical sense. Well, in some way, or some druggy sense even, if I took enough mushrooms that had been blessed by a defrocked Anglican minister who was now a cross-dresser and a semi-professional wrestler, if I did all of that, then I'd fall into some kind of trance, and then I'd see the purpose of life. I'll again assume that you people are sort of intellectually grown up enough that you're not really caught up with that kind of sticky glue. So it's not that, but it's something else that I was going to propose. It's still the kind of things that have been talked about before, the basis of it, that if there is some way to understand the purpose of man, blah, blah, it's got to be from some extraordinary view in religions and all sorts of transcendental philosophies and etc. throughout the ages have sort of presented that setup to say, well, it's an ordinary man cannot just suddenly sit down one day and say, well, let's see, I don't have anything to do, I'll figure out the purpose of life. It's, oh, I see. They say you cannot do that. They say you must come and become a part of our flock. You must join up in our institution. You must subscribe to our philosophy. You must follow some revealed source from the cosmic forces that will tell you, because it's a very complex matter. The complexity is this, is that from the view in which the instrument is constructed, can never transcend, can never go beyond the limits of the construction. That it's not that weird, although you couldn't prove it by just what I said, could you? Thanks a lot. Back to this for 1 second again, if you need this. I don't know why I have faith in this. It just seems like it's so hardware-ish, intangible, that I keep thinking it'll grab some of you. But the whole idea, you understand, of physics, getting down into particle physics or into cosmology, into astrophysics, like into the particle, according to the, not just quantum theory, but according to their actual claim of the physical realities of it, that the more precise becomes the optical instruments, the measuring instruments, to try and get to the subatomic level. That the more it interferes with what you're trying to see. And they blame it. But they attribute it to the fault of technology, the limits of the physical world. And on the other hand, with all going in another direction through astrophysics, it's like, other than now getting into electronics support systems, but at the physical level, it has already reached the point that the actual size of optic telescopes, the lenses, not the telescopes, but the lenses had reached such a point. They look further and further back in time, or further and further out in space. The lenses were getting so big that the weight itself began to distort it. And so it seems to be, boy, we have a real problem here, that going down smaller and smaller, that the more precise this gets, and it gets down closer and closer, the more it actually physically affects that level of reality. And so what we're looking at is being distorted by us trying to look at it. And then, by God, if that's not enough, which of course in the ordinary world people only are experts in one field, but then if we leave them and go to guys looking in another direction in the heavens, they got the same kind of problem. The more and more they can see, at least at the physical level, the optic, the light wave level, all we got to do is make bigger and bigger lenses, right? I mean, it's like making smaller and smaller, more precise telescopes to look in that direction. All we got to do is make bigger lenses, but now they've reached the point, the lens is already so big that physically, the weight of them begins to sag. But you people, I keep bringing up these examples that I try to trick you if you need to be tricked. Well, yes, all of that. I've even read some of that, and that's good old everyday hard-headed science. Except for this. Do you see, can't be proven, remember, but can you see that the real problem is not technology? Not that they don't have a problem. You always got limitations in a 3D world, such as the lens and the telescope, and of course now the human mind is going in other ways to make up for that. But let's stay right there for a second. Do you see that it is not simply limitations of technology? It's not limitations of the elements of this planet. It is not the limitations of the physical production of machinery to aid in the senses, which is all the machines are. It is not the limitations of that ultimately. The ordinary mind can't see it because the ultimate limit is the mind. Now I know that they can prove, which, whew, God, talk about a side trip. I'm sure that they can mathematically prove that the size of a telescope and etc. and the kind of focal point, focal range and all of that, that they have reached it already, and I'm sure it can be put in a small equation, that the size of an actual glass, plastic, ground lens in a telescope has already reached the point that it begins its own weight, sags it, so it distorts. In other words, if we make one bigger, instead of seeing better, we'll see worse. Now let's accept that that's true. There's no reason to say it's not. It makes sense. But do you understand that in a way that cannot be proven, and in a way that is really impertinent in the ordinary world, that is not really the limit. The limit is here. It's not the lens. There's an even faster ditch here that I had no intention of getting into. But it's that the more the limits get pushed in the human mind, they become less of what appears to be limits. I can't resist. May I assume that some of you followed that last part because there was nothing great insight on my part to point out that which is already a fact. Let's take the telescope, the lens. Everybody does understand that. I'm just repeating, I'm taking their word for it, as you should. Anyway, I know it's true. That the lenses have gotten so large, they got to the point that they could see out such and such light years. And so they made a lens a little bit bigger. But it got to the point, which is just a variation of the interference, in the quantum theories and the quantum practice of interfering with the actual observation, that the observation itself is interfering. But now, this may seem easier to picture, they make a lens just another foot wider in diameter, let's say. And the son of a bitch sags. Now you understand, you can't go into there and say, well, you know, you understand, you can't put something on the bottom like, well, there's no problem there, just, you know, get some 2x4s and shore that mother up. You know, I'm sure you can do that, but then you look and, hey, something's in the way. The shoring's in the way. But anyway, it is another one of those beautiful examples. They know how to do it. The machinery is better, they can grind. And so they make the lens, they extend it an inch. I'm sure they did more, 10 feet. And the son of a bitch, now, it got bigger, but now, just going that little bit further, the weight now sags, pulls, gravity pulls it, and now it got bigger, that theoretically would have been true, can see further, see better, except now it sees worse because the weight of it pulls it down and it distorts. This second side trip I was going to carry you to show you the beauty of this, what happened? They're not limited to that anymore, which was not part of why I took off the side trip originally, because now, using, just to make it crudely, computer enhancement, by being able to digitize information, they can take in even what they had before they made the larger lens, and they can, I'm not going to try to give you a lesson in that, even if I could, but you do understand that they can now, they simply moved the locale of the technology. Except they didn't simply move it out there, they went from the actual physical lens of an old optic telescope. They went from that when they realized we can't get any bigger. So they went back to where they were when it wasn't sagging, and they took the information that was there, turned it into numbers, knew how to write a program, and could now, in a different way, Now electronically rather than optically, they can see in a sense, in a real sense. They can see further and better than they did. Because the human mind had reached. Out in the scientific world, out in the ordinary world, they said the technology had gone as far as it could. Again, I repeat, I'm not saying it didn't. That's beside the point. The human mind assumed it had, that we can't make a lens any bigger. They all agreed, all the experts. We can't do it. Well, that's the end of that, isn't it? Not quite. The human mind simply went somewhere else. But nobody seems to notice. They're not supposed to, but nobody knows. Wait a minute. Did you know we keep hitting these things? At one time it seemed like steam. How much further can we go with steam? Boy, the Industrial Revolution was going like wildfire and we was all making money. And Jesus, don't make me back up and try to make up some example. Steam powered, running factories, finally reached a point of diminishing returns. What appears to be technology, nobody ever, of course, wants to apply this to the world of thought, such as religion and psychology. No. But in the world that appears to be out there, it will always reach a point that begins to be diminishing returns. That is, we'll make the lens a little bit bigger, we can see better. They make it bigger, they see worse. That's no job for Captain Irony. I don't have to keep him out of here. He got no place in that. It's only ordinary where it goes, ha, ha, ha. And I'll teach those little scientists a lesson. Probably a bunch of atheists anyway. It simply reaches a point, but no one notices it. What I was getting at was no one ever says, isn't it strange throughout the history of man that we apparently, our forefathers and our forescientists, our fore-inventors, it seemed like they finally reached the point and things were going along like gangbusters. Of course, back then people said, what does gangbusters mean? But that's before we invented J. Edgar Hoover. But nobody looks back and says, well, it looks like the technology reached up to a point and it became a technical, a tangible, a physical cul-de-sac. We couldn't go any further. And yet then something else happened. Steam, like finally somebody learned how, just sort of happened. Suddenly, man, you have to handle electricity. And so the limitations of steam, they're just forgotten. Nobody stood around and laughed at steam. They didn't put up some kind of museum like, let's all be cynical about steam. And nobody went around thinking, I invested all my money in steam and now look at it. They're running televisions by electricity instead of steam now and I'm going to lose everything. It's just forgotten. And no one notices. I mean, if anybody brought up steam, they say, well, maybe there should be a steam museum because it served us well, but it had its limits. Nobody ever says, wait a minute. It's not just the technology, because every time that seems to happen, the human brain comes up with something else. You don't like that? Well, oh, you like it, you just don't know it. Well, do you go home, do you try to run when it's cold, you try to plug in a steam blanket? I mean, you take the technology, that is, you take what seems to be the technology, which I'm suggesting to you is the continual progress of the human brain. But no one ever applies it to that. They do not see that the limitations action. They're not supposed to, of course, but do you see? I'll try it one more time. It is something really in there. There's no reason I stay with it. There is no doubt, let us say, that they have reached the physical limit of putting optic lenses, actual physical lenses in telescopes, that if they go any bigger, the lens itself, by its own weight, just by making it bigger, will sag and distort. So, what else can we do? There's no doubt they have reached that point. But that was not really the point that they reached, although it's true. The point was here. It's very sticky. It's right outside of 4 dimensions. This is not proof, but to be physically, verbally lax about it, I'll say the proof is this, that was not the limit. Did that stop anything? Well, no. But that was actually the limit. They couldn't physically make them any bigger. Okay. But that wasn't the problem. Well, sure it was. Oh, you're just saying that men, well, they figured out some other way to do it. But that still doesn't change the fact that the lens will begin to sag. No, you got me. But that's still not the problem. Well, you can't say I hadn't tried to beat you with it. Well, back to where we were. If there was any possibility of some fairly casual way of describing or trying to perceive a purpose for human life, the uniqueness of human life, assuming you're beyond the idea of a religious soul according to some human institution, it would have to be in a context that was absolutely, I hate to stay technical on that, but weird. Those of you who majored in physics, you can tell the rest of them after. It would have to be in a context that was not normal. The abnormality of it is as simple as this. The context would have to be that which would most easily be described as the future. Which, of course, is really weird to say that, but at least it's not as weird as somebody saying, well, man's purpose can only be described as the will of God. Now, I assume most of you grew up around some religious environment, and you don't really think that's weird anymore. You may not be actively pursuing it, but at least the will of God, makes some kind of sense, right? Sure. But to say, well, if there's any possible way to explain a purpose for man or even try to get a glimpse of it, it'd have to be in the context of the future, which the future is probably as common a word almost as God or will. But the future is not a thing. I mean, the future is not a person. You can't even anthropomorphize the future. You can't even picture it. All right, the future is some guy hanging down the road there that's got all of our names and everything that's going to happen to us in his pocket. It just doesn't make much sense. So let's assume that we're back up to where we left off. Just figuratively speaking, of course, trust me. Let's just roll on. Take note of how common it is for men to say, and they do not have to be in some clinical state of depression, and they may not use these exact words. But look how common it is for the human intellect, for men to say in various ways how they feel that they're nothing. I repeat, it may not be someone who's ever even used that term, but if a man is sitting around, a man who seems to be fairly well sailing along with the ordinary world in the city, an ordinary person, and hear someone say, either philosophically, somebody a few feet this side of being absolutely deranged by depression, but just another fairly reasonable person on television or in a conversation, and he says, sometimes, maybe they're discussing the nature of life, and this and that, some various way, and a man will say something about, sometimes I just feel like that, I don't take it all that personal, but I just feel like that I'm almost nothing. Of course, we are aware of the fact that many people are wired up that they will say, I am nothing. I feel terrible, and all that. Well, I'm not laughing. That's part of the same thing, but there is this feeling. And if you've never used the term, or if you don't think it's that common, just consider how, if it were not for what I'm describing, people would not pursue religion of any sort. People would not fear any aspect of the unknown. There is a certain feeling of nothingness that people experience beyond any religious quotation marks around the feeling, but just a certain kind of nothingness. There is a plain reason for that. That has nothing to do with religion, has nothing to do with psychology, although their own descriptions are their own descriptions and they serve a purpose. But there is a very plain reason for this kind of feeling of being almost nothing. Even if you're not pressed by some immediate apparent situation of despair, but just this kind of feeling. And the plain reason is this: that an ordinary person is in a normal, healthy, continual state of secondary incompleteness. Now, this gets crudely translated into a kind of, I'm not even going to go with this side trip, it's a kind of mental feeling of nothingness. Now I repeat one more time, don't get hung on that. It's not somebody either clinically depressed or someone who is trying to feign being a neo-romantic poet. To have to fall and say, oh, I'm nothing. Life is nothing. I'm a poor nothing. I am just spit on the sidewalk of life. I don't mean all that. It's just this thing of nothing. Because you know you can walk out of here and your life can be shot, hit by a car, you can just drop dead. Your best friends, your family people die and their body rots. And it's just like we're just almost nothing. But there is a reason for that. Religion tries to take up for it. Talk about a hopeless task again, but there's religion at the end of the parade. Psychology tries, everybody tries in some way. People try, bartenders try. Here, have another drink. Everybody, there's some way to try it, but there's a simple reason. And the reason is not from the same kind of view that people experience. The mental feeling of, I'm just almost nothing. Or somebody says, I feel like I'm nothing. Then other people around them tend to go, yeah. Not about them, but you feel like, well, yeah, I know what you mean. But there is a simple, healthy reason. Because the reason is anyone who feels that is simply experiencing the normal, healthy feeling of man's continual secondary incompleteness, not primary. Because if you're primarily incomplete, there's nothing to be done. Get you a wooden leg, get you a toupee. If you're short one ear, get you an aluminum ear and hook it up. I don't know. But there's nothing to be done about that. You're primarily complete. The fine art of plastic surgery notwithstanding, you are primarily complete. It is a secondary incompleteness. Even though I described it as healthy, and it does come out in a crude translation of people feeling that it's anything but healthy. Because even if they just state it as a kind of philosophical passing thought of saying, well, I feel kind of incomplete, or they internally agree to someone else saying that they feel like that they're kind of nothing, and you say, yeah. If you stopped suddenly, if you jumped into someone's nervous system and said, do you find this in any way positive? They go, no, because something's lacking. I mean, it's something in me that I should be doing. Or I don't go around saying I'm nothing, but when that other guy was talking that way and said that he sometimes felt like he was nothing, I knew what he meant. And I don't spend my whole life worried about that, but I know what he meant. And if I said, well, what does that say to you? The person would say, well, it says that, I'm lacking somewhere. There's something I'm not doing. There's something I'm not doing correctly. I don't know what it is. I'm not religious. I don't know what it is. I just feel I can empathize with a man saying that he feels like he's nothing. So it comes out in the crude translation that if I then had to, or allowed the person I was talking to respond in a normal polarized way, I'd say, well, how do you feel about it? They would have to say, well, I don't like it. In other words, given positive or negative, which is the only thing they could react to, they'd say, well, it is a negative manifestation, or else I wouldn't feel it. In other words, I would not feel as though, yeah, I know what you mean when you say you feel almost nothing, because it means that there is something that I'm not doing. There's something lacking. Contraire, withal, do-si-do, to that being a kind of crude translation of a negative sort. If we had someone, let us say, who was radically sighted, a subversive, a neuro-subversive, if he was in for his yearly exam, the best words he would ever hear would be for the doctor to come out and say, well, Mr. Smith, you are totally incomplete. By God, we're going to wrap this part of this up. Well, now, if you follow all that, Does that help? Now we finally come to the last force, only taking us, whatever it's been, the third force. I kept threatening to get to, and here we go. The hey, get out of here force, our new operational name for it. And how it in some way might be equal to, or we could treat it as equal to, the future. Whew, Jesus. All right, finally. But is there anything left to say? I know verbally I have cross-pollinated. I hate it, but most of that will wash off. I know that it seemed like I've talked this and that, but if you were actually keeping some kind of specific written notes or verbal notes, we were actually just covered the first one and the second. I consider we just wrapped up number 2. The what do you want force and its possible correlation, or treating it as if it were equal to, as being equal to the present. And we had not specifically said, all right, now we're going to talk about the third one. So now I'm saying we are going to talk about the third one, but I'm also now saying, what else the hell can we say about it? Even though we have not specifically been addressing it. Hello. What else can you say? Have we not covered it in a kind of indirect manner? What else can you say after you have noted, first off, that the past, here we go, we're going to do a, what you call it, a retrospective. All right, that was enough. Well, listen, we're running late. Once you have said, as we have already done, because all of you joined in, you helped, I considered your notes, and when you danced on and you did your part. Once you have pointed out first force, that we're calling it common, the familiar, and how it might, that we could reckon it as equal to the past, and then to fully try to see that kind of picture of this kind of first force being common, familiar, predictable, even boring. I could have guessed it all the way from institutional history to what happened to you yesterday. Then on to the second part of the renamed force, the second one of, what do you want? And treating it as being equal to the present. And then pointing out that while man's ordinary mind can find the past to be boring, too predictable, can find the future to be kind of unsettling, at least uncertain, and so there's only one place that man could actually be comfortable. And as we so well proved, or you proved to my satisfaction, it turns out not to be so. And for everyone who still disbelieves it, or who wasn't here last time, or who heard it and didn't like it, even if you look upon the past and the future as being too boring, too unsettling, too uncertain, well, at least I got the present, that I can rely on. Boy, what are you thinking with? If that be true, then why is it the human mind spends almost no time, almost none, outside the other two apparent time frames? How often do you think of right now, if there is such a thing? And of course, if you think about right now, then right then there is, secondarily speaking, such a thing, but how often do you do that? I assume all of you don't have to pull out your calculator and figure, so I'll tell you. I mean, that's just sort of an average. There is simply no relief in the present if it exists. And from one view, man has no interest in the present if it exists. And if you say, well, yes, I do. Oh, yes, then you're still left with the question, well, how come you never think about it? And we're not going to play with such childish people, even though I can play their part for them, which sometimes is frightening, for them to say, wait a minute, I sure do think of the present. I think about it all the time. We're not going to deal with those people. You got yourself to deal with. You're those people. If If there is something good about it, if there is something worthwhile about it, then how come nobody thinks about it? So once you've done those two, what else is there to say about any third force, much less its possible correlation to the third time frame, the future? What's left to say? The present, if it did exist, would seem to waver. You can use your own descriptions if you don't like mine some other time, but I'm going to wrap up the verbal part tonight. It seems to waver somewhere. If it exists, if you stop and talk about it, people's ordinary mind will say, yeah, it exists. And once you stop right there and talk about it, it does seem to exist because we're talking about it right now, right? We're not talking about it last week, okay? And you're not somewhere in some kind of spooky future looking like you're fading in out like some cheap special effects on the Home Shopping Network. That if we're talking about the future, much less making hand gestures and being serious, if we're talking about the future, then this is the future because that's the way we talk about it. You got me. So if it does exist, does it not still seem to waver, though, when you try to think about it, even right now? If by thinking about it, we make it exist, how about that? Even if we do, it seems to waver from being unstable. That is, if you quit thinking about it real sincerely, then suddenly you're thinking about that you were just thinking about it. And if you're real good, you think, uh-oh, I'm back in the past now. Right. So even if we agree, all right, the future or the present can exist, but the only way it can exist is you got to think about it right now. You got to think, this is the present, and then it exists. All right, I'll go with that. You got to admit it's pretty unstable, don't you? Think about it. You do realize what happened. If you do that and you think about it, then it's no longer the present. Or if I say, all right, now if everybody's thinking about it, are you making the present exist? Have you become your own creator? You have made the present exist by thinking that this is the present. Yes, I have. All right. Do you realize the ramification of this, where it might lead? All right, then you can look off in the other direction instead of looking in the past. When I say, well, are you doing? Then you go, Then if it did exist, it's gone now. So it wavers, even if it exists. If you can make it exist, you got to admit, it wavers. It wavers somewhere from being unstable, unreliable, and if you can see it real quick, even possibly, very possibly unnecessary. Inasmuch as you never think about it. Yes, but it's very necessary. Well, if it is, it doesn't need you to think about it. Do you realize that? We got to get fast here, folks. We got 4 minutes. If the present exists, how come nobody thinks about it? Well, I do think about it. What you do right now? Yes, I do. What were you just before? Wait a minute, let me think. Are you going to make the present exist next week? Or how about on your birthday? Or how about next time something important happens? Well, let's see. Why is it not a natural, friendly, stable place to be? Well, I don't know. In fact, I was asking. There you are. Once you've said all that, what else is there to say about the future? What are we going to say? Well, I'd already slipped up a little in the last few nights and said that from one view, if people even thought about the future, they're inclined to find the futures, even the idea, ultimately, to either seem to be irrelevant or sort of unfriendly. And we talked about it several nights ago under different guise. I'm not had time to go back over it. But if people are pushed to think, well, yes, the future maybe is a something. It either seems irrelevant in the same way that we've got, from one view, the past and the present. The first and second force there in Parliament, and a conservative or a liberal stands up with an idea, proposes a bill, and he gets immediate resistance from the second force, whichever one it is, it doesn't matter, from the other side of the aisle. And then they got, well, what are we going to do? And then there's all the people in the back benches, all those taking naps, even though their own party, independents. They got to go start working with them, but to begin with, they seem irrelevant. When the guy stands up said, here's what we should do regarding national health. And he's caught up into his own blah, blah, blah. And another guy said, wait a minute. No. And all those taking naps back there, all those out in the hallways, all the guys that went down to the bathroom seem to be irrelevant. Or those that say, I'm not interested in health. But they've eventually got to be interested because they're going to vote. And so the future is either perceived as being irrelevant at that particular moment. Like, well, I don't care about them. I got my own axe to grind here. But eventually, you got to care about what seems to be irrelevant because they got to vote on it. If not that, the other way, the ordinary mind has to look at it, they find it frightening. If I jumped in and said, wait a minute, do you realize that the future of your bill, perhaps the future of your political career, is dependent upon the future? That is, the guys back here in the back that are taking naps, those that are not part of your party, those that don't even have an interest in your particular field of expertise, which is national health. Jesus, I never thought about it that way. In other words, those people who are irrelevant, those people who are not either for me or against me, even worse, because they're against me, maybe I could bribe them. Or maybe I could talk them into it, or let them sleep with my second cousin. But these people are not even interested. That's frightening. Except for this. You can strike except, but there's no word in 3 dimensions to cover it. That the future can seem to be, from ordinary view, either irrelevant or frightening. But this is in the same way that new ideas always seem far too unstable and uncertain, and thus are frightening. So what else is there left to say about the future? Except, if I had the piano player, I'd say, vamp me out. Can you pick up? It's an ode, closing ode to the future. Can you read it? Does it show up? Take me to the fridge. Fade us out.